I'm Eric Stoner. I'm one of the co-founders and editors of Waging Nonviolence, and I want to welcome you to our interactive webinar today titled Countering Violence and Building People Power in Afghanistan. It's also a fundraiser for at-risk women and girls in the field, and we very much appreciate your generous donations through ticket sales. We're also hoping that you're open to today to giving more if you're able, and we'll let you know how later. We're very happy to be one of the co-conveners today, along with Solidarity 2020 and Beyond and Nonviolence International. I'd like to just say a little bit about the work of Waging Nonviolence. We're an online publication dedicated to providing original reporting and expert analysis on social movements and activism around the world. We work to advance the public's understanding of how ordinary people build power and their key role in shaping politics. Since our founding in 2009, we have put a special focus on overlooked movements in the global South, facilitating cross-cultural knowledge and skill sharing in the process. You can find us at wagingnonviolence.org. I want to just go over the structure for today's webinar panel and some guidelines and procedures. We are streaming live on Zoom, and we'll be monitoring the comments and questions. This event is being recorded, and by participating, you are agreeing to the webinar being reposted on the YouTube channels of Waging Nonviolence and Solidarity 2020 and Beyond. This panel is scheduled for 90 minutes and will include brief presentations and overviews by the panelists, and then discussion among the group. The last 20 minutes will be open for discussion, comments, and Q&A with participants. If you have questions, please type them into the chat section. And when called upon by the moderator, you have the option of unmuting and asking your question or comment directly. We know people have different perspectives and positions and welcome those, but we ask that you communicate these respectfully, or we will delete comments and or remove you from the event. You'll receive a link to share the recording of this program after it's complete, and can sign up now in the link in the chat box for the next webinar on October 27th at the same time. It's called Acting in Good Faith, Religion, Peacebuilding, and Nonviolent Action, featuring activist faith leaders from countries struggling with violent conflict around the world. Next, I'll turn it over to Michael Beer, an old friend of mine from Nonviolence International, another co-sponsor and long-term peace and justice organization. Michael.
Thank you, Eric. Thank you, everybody, for attending today. It's going to be a fantastic webinar. I'm very excited. Nonviolence International works to promote the movement for nonviolence around the world. Please join us as a volunteer and supporter and go to our website, nonviolenceinternational.net. We focus on 3 areas at the moment: nonviolent tactics education, with a website that has 346 tactics that we've collected from around the world. We have a book that I've just written called The Civil Resistance Tactics of the 21st Century. And we do a second piece of work, which is a lot of work around training, since training is so important to prepare people for the heavy lifting we all have to do to help save the world and move it forward. And you can find this big training archive, the largest in the world for nonviolence, at nonviolence.rutgers.edu. And finally, we are a backbone organization for the nonviolent movement, and we sponsor projects and groups from around the world. We used to sponsor Waging Nonviolence, but before it spun off and became an independent group. We sponsor a lot of Palestinian solidarity groups and justice groups, humanitarian disarmament projects, and we're the sponsor of Solidarity 2020 and Beyond. And with that, I would like to introduce Catherine Hughes Freytag, who is the moderator for today's event. She's co-founder and director of Solidarity 2020 and Beyond, an amazing activist going back many decades, working with social justice movements around the world. She's a master's degree from American University in conflict resolution and peace studies. She's great specialization in the Middle East, and she's done enormous amounts of work in nonprofit management and movement support and training. And she's just, I couldn't imagine a better moderator for today's event. So Catherine, the floor is yours.
Thanks for the introduction, Michael. I'm Catherine Hughes Freytag, one of the co-founders of the Solidarity 2020 and Beyond initiative. We're a network and growing coalition of organizations, activists, scholars, journalists, and psychosocial practitioners. We believe in the power of ordinary people to organize and mobilize to change injustices in our local communities and, by extension, the world. We believe that this pandemic is a key trigger moment, providing new opportunities, but also dangerous new realities as well. Our website is Solidarity 2020 and Beyond. Check us out and like us on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. If you're an activist, join our Global Grassroots Activists Network, our GGAN, now with 150 plus members from 70 countries, representing more than 100 campaigns and movements around the world. You can do this by emailing us at solidarity2020andbeyond@gmail.com. I want to thank our great team, our new Assistant Director, Steve Chase, co-founders and Rotary Peace Fellows, Marita Rainbird from Finland and Vedran Obacina from Croatia. Now, as moderator of this interactive discussion and panel today, I'll give a little background and introduce our panelists. All eyes are on Afghanistan right now. Although the country has been struggling with ongoing violence, occupation, militarism, underdevelopment, poverty, and attacks on marginalized communities for decades. There is no lack of analysis on structural and systemic issues related to imperialism, internal and external corruption, and the big power games between world entities to control their resources, land, and people. We hear that Afghanistan's banking system is almost collapsed, that its infrastructure of electricity, water, and food distribution is barely functioning, and that up to 80% of its population is at risk now that the Taliban has taken over, and many countries are refusing to recognize the government or deal with it. Afghans are struggling to survive the coming winter, and women, girls, and minorities are all at greatest risk. While all of this is true and critical to engage with, our webinar series focuses on the grassroots and everyday people, how in violent and dire situations they build agency and people power and fight back against injustice through strategic nonviolent action and movements and campaigns, disrupting the status quo when necessary and creating constructive programs and new systems and parallel institutions. Having worked myself for a few months in Afghanistan in 2019, focused on supporting women's organizing and empowerment, especially related to the peace process, I saw firsthand the amazing dedication, courage, and desire from Afghans to build a better life for their families, children, and communities. These are the issues we'll be focusing on today with our brilliant panel and participant feedback and shared knowledge from you all. So I want to get started. I'm going to start with introducing Jamila Raqib. She's a specialist in the study and practice of strategic nonviolent action and the executive director of the Albert Einstein Institution, which works to advance the research and application of nonviolent action worldwide. For more than 15 years, she worked closely with the late Dr. Gene Sharp, the world's foremost scholar of the field of strategic nonviolent action. She was born and raised in Afghanistan and most recently traveled to Jalalabad, spending time with family and her community in 2019. Next, we have Dr. Zaher Wahab. He's an Afghanistan academic who served as senior advisor to the Minister of Higher Education in Afghanistan from 2002 to 2006, and as a visiting researcher professor in a master's degree program for teacher education faculty from Afghanistan's 16 teacher training programs from 2007 to 2010. Between 2002 and 12, he spent about 4 months annually in his home country while teaching at Lewis and Clark College in the United States as well. He then moved back full-time to Afghanistan and founded 2 master's programs at the American University of Afghanistan, which is based in Kabul. Happy Kelly is a U.S. peace activist and author well known to many of us, who has made over 24 trips to Afghanistan from 2010 to 19, living with Afghan peace volunteers in a working-class neighborhood in Kabul. She and her companions in various peace team delegations believe that where you stand determines what you see. Kelly lived with families in Baghdad throughout the 2003 shock and awe invasion and during the first weeks of the U.S. occupation. She is now campaigning for an international treaty to ban weaponized drones and has also worked on Israel, Palestine, Yemen, and other critical issues and conflicts in the Middle East. Dr. Stellan Vinthagen, last but not least for sure, hi Stellan, is professor of sociology and the inaugural endowed chair in the study of nonviolent direct action and civil resistance at the University of Massachusetts Amherst. And we think this is probably the only such endowed chair in the world that is focused specifically on civil resistance and nonviolent direct action, although the field is really growing as we speak. He directs the Resistance Studies Initiative there and is also the editor of the Journal of Resistance Studies and the co-leader of the Resistance Studies group at the University of Gothenburg, Sweden, where he is from originally. He has participated in numerous nonviolent civil disobedience actions for which he has served a total of more than 1 year in prison. And he was one of those was on the vote to Gaza that was attacked by Israelis trying to reach Gaza to put attention on their blockade over many, many years. So let's get started. This will be a very engaging, interesting webinar. We hope for a lot of participant involvement, and we'll be asking specific questions of the panelists to get at their unique expertise and skills in people power and nonviolent direct action and possibilities for engagement in Afghanistan currently. Thank you very much. So I'm going to start with Zahir. And let me get you in the spotlight, Zahir.
Okay. Good morning. Good morning to you all. I'm speaking to you from Portland, Oregon.
Yes, and
I want to thank all of you for organizing the webinar, and would like to thank all of the participants, the virtual participants. As pointed out, my connection to Afghanistan is that I was born, raised, and schooled in Afghanistan. And then I was sent on scholarships to the American University of Beirut, Columbia, and Stanford, and then ended up in Portland, Oregon at Lewis and Clark College. I have never really intended to live outside of Afghanistan forever and not have anything to do with it, but circumstances have forced me to sort of be outside and try to go in as much as I can. I have been there for the last 20 years. I have been there many, many times and spent the last 7 years from 13 to October 19th at the American University of Afghanistan. I should point out that the University of Massachusetts Amherst was very heavily involved in Afghan education from 2006 until 2018. And I have worked with them very closely. It's a wonderful university, Stellan. I don't know if many of you watched the interview with the head of the Norwegian Refugee Council last night on PBS. And then the night before, there was an excellent frontline for 1 hour on PBS on Afghanistan. And both of these were very, very recent and very current. And you could get an idea what life is like in Afghanistan. As pointed out, right now, nothing seems to work in Afghanistan. Banks, the government, schools, by and large, universities, the economy, the healthcare system, agriculture, etc., electricity, water, and so forth are in a state of paralysis. And what the head of the Norwegian Council said last night, that we actually have no time in Afghanistan. We don't even have weeks. What he said, we need to do something in just a few days, because, and I know this, that 2/3 of the Afghans right now are really hungry. And it's estimated that the way things are, by the end of the year, this year, 97% of the people will have no food, which means 10 millions of people right now are on the edge of starvation. So it's a very serious situation. And for those of us who know people there and have family members, I have countless former students, colleagues, associates, relatives, and so forth, and so does my wife. So for us, it's not just intellectual, ideological, but it's also a very personal issue, problem, and challenge. And it's pointed out, and it has been observed by many, many people, thoughtful people here. I would say, to summarize, the root cause of all of the misery, pain, and suffering, degradation, and violence really is imperialism. Old and new imperialism, old and new colonialism, British, Russian, and currently or more recently, American. Well, as I said, I've been working mostly with higher education, either pre-service or in-service professional development. And my work there was, like here at Lewis and Clark College, was really guided by the work of John Dewey, Paulo Freire, Henry Giroux, Cornel West, and Bell Hooks, among others. And what I try to do in Afghanistan, in my work, conferences and teachings and so forth, was to indigenize the educational experience, because education by and large is sort of a Xerox copy of old European education. And I thought what was needed really to localize and indigenize the purpose, essence, methods, and curriculum of education. So that's one thing I try to do. And then I will just name briefly what I try to emphasize: promote critical theory and critical thinking, problematize live life's problems, consciousness raising or conscientization, as Paulo Freire put it, empowerment of men, women, children, etc., inculcating a sense of responsibility, a sense of ethics, and ethnic, not only ethnic identity, but also ethnic harmony, liberation, psychological, physical, economic, social, and cultural, to free people, in particular the oppressed, women, minorities, and so forth, from the straitjackets of ethnicity, class, gender, and race. And I try to sort of conscientize them. Promote notions of peace and justice and equity. In short, what I tried to do was really sort of to apply the principles of what is referred to in this country as the liberal arts education in its very best sense. And I also tried to make sense for our associates and students the interconnection between education, culture, and politics, that in fact, these three are closely interconnected and at times almost indistinguishable. But I also tried to point the connection between race, class, and gender within the context of the Afghan society. While I was trying, and there were several other people some from abroad, but mostly Afghans, we tried to do our best as we could. At the same time, acutely aware of sort of a total body cancer afflicted the Afghan society. We saw all around us, from the very high council of the country, that is, say, the presidential palace, all the way down to an elementary school teacher or a simple farmer or a government bureaucrat and so forth. When we looked at the culture, the society, the politics, the corruption, the mismanagement, the indifference, the inhumanity, people almost behaving like animals toward other people, I have to say. We realized that society was sort of afflicted by a not so invisible total body cancer. And the total body cancer was the decay of society. And I connected this with, again, the very history of imperialism, colonialism, and neo-colonialism and imperialism. A lot of people have suggested what we should do, and so did the program on PBS last night and the night before. And so far, no one recognizes the Taliban regime. The Taliban regime, as we know, is medieval. It's problematic. It's dysfunctional. It's hardly functioning. But we should also point out that the Taliban were sort of made to move into Kabul because the agreement in early August was between the United States, President Ghani, the then president, the Taliban, and so forth, that there will be an interim government, and that interim government will take over around mid-August, and then Ashraf Ghani would leave the country or the situation, and Taliban will take over. That agreement was being preempted, as we know, by the presidency of four. People refer to Ashraf Ghani's presidency as the presidency of four. President Ghani, Rola Ghani, his wife, Mr. Moheb, his National Security Council president, Mr. Fazli, his chief of staff. There were, in other words, four presidents and not just one. On August 15th, they preempted all of the arrangements which were carried out on paper and escaped the country with truckloads of money. So that's where we stand. There's no money because the money was stolen by the Americans, other contractors, Afghans and Afghan Americans. There's no food, there's no money, there are no banks, nothing seems to work. And no one has recognized the Afghan regime because foreigners point out that the preconditions for the recognition of the Taliban government are an inclusive government, the observation of human rights, women's rights and equity between men and women, safe passage for internationals and Afghans who work with the United States, and finally to disallow, for the Taliban to disallow Afghanistan to become a training ground or a launching pad for terrorism against other countries. Other than
Wahab,
we should.
I'm going to interrupt you. We've
Yes.
got about, you've done an amazing job to set us up and do the kind of the meta-analysis.
Okay.
We're definitely going to come back to you for other questions.
Thank you very
So
much.
thank you very
Yes.
much. And as I told everyone, I'm going to be a little bit of a
Thank you.
tough moderator, so much
Thank you. I'm sorry. And
appreciated.
I'll share with you what people have suggested.
Perfect. Thank you very much. Okay. So moving on, I want to mention that this webinar series is very specific in that we'll be focusing on grassroots and everyday people, how in violent and dire situations they build agency and people power and fight back against injustice through strategic nonviolent action and movements, disrupting the status quo and creating constructive programs and new systems and institutions. So I'm going to pass it off now to Jamila, who is a real specialist in this area, and we're so happy to have you here. And Jamila, your first question is, tell me about your connection to Afghanistan, your ongoing work, and why Afghanistan in the current future there matters so much to you. And then moving in, we know that you worked with Gene Sharp for many, many years. Can you tell us about nonviolent mobilizing campaigns and movements in Afghanistan's recent history and what they tell us about options for action and building people power in today's environment? Go ahead, Jamila.
Thank you so much, Catherine. And thank you, Dr. Wahab, for that unfortunate and really grim overview of the situation in Afghanistan. And thanks to everyone who's joining us and to my fellow panelists for this opportunity to take part in this discussion. It's great to be among so many friends and colleagues. So I was born in Afghanistan, but I lived in the US since I was 4. And my family came to the US as refugees during the Soviet War. So when people ask me when my family fled Afghanistan, I tell them it was 2 wars ago. I've lived my whole life in the shadow of one brutal war after another. And watching these more recent terrible scenes of fear and desperation, and learning about the level of suffering that's taking place in the country, the poverty, this really perfect storm of conditions that's creating a real political and humanitarian crisis in the country. It's really bringing back a lot of the trauma and sense of helplessness and powerlessness that I experienced as a child. So the child refugee perspective is one lens through which I understand the situation in Afghanistan, but I'm also a nonviolent resistance educator, which means that I think in terms of possibilities in spite of difficult situations. You can imagine that when people learn that I'm from Afghanistan and that I work on promoting nonviolent alternatives to violent conflict, that I get the question very often, is there a nonviolent solution in Afghanistan? Do the tools that we think hold such great relevance for so many of our societies, do they offer a way forward for Afghanistan, a means to address the decades-long violence and war and oppression? So Afghanistan is a tough case. I'm under no illusions as to the severity of the political and humanitarian crisis. It's truly heartbreaking. We're hearing from family members all the time. My family was recently in touch with a family member who was asked, by 10 different people whether she had been sent any money from abroad because they had no food. And we know that the World Food Program has announced that there's, up to 14 million people and maybe more facing starvation. So it's really that serious. But I think the best indication in terms of the potential for people power movements in Afghanistan, the best indication of what's possible in Afghanistan, like in each of our countries, is really to look at what has been made possible by brave and persistent people in the past. We have a history of nonviolent resistance just across the border. The Khudai Khidmatkar movement in the 1920s, 30s, and 40s was an incredibly disciplined, important movement that offers a lot of insight, in fact, not just for the region, but for the world. More recently, we've seen a number of major movements emerge in the past decade or so, mostly led by young people. Many of these movements were spontaneous in the sense that they emerged really in response to specific government policies, acts of insurgent violence, or general dissatisfaction with the government. Some of these movements have been along ethnic lines, but even those had really diverse participation, and leaders were often very careful to express demands that spoke to wider national concerns. So there's quite a number, and in fact, in preparing for this time today, me and my colleagues were really doing an overview of recent movements, and there's in fact too many to discuss here, which is, I think, grounds for real hope. Just a couple of them though: the Enlightenment or Roshani movement. It emerged in 2016 after the Afghan government announced that it was going to reroute a major power line to basically bypass the Hazarajat, which is a region that is heavily underdeveloped and it's mainly occupied by the Hazara ethnic group. And people saw this as a move, sort of another example of the way in which this community was disenfranchised and discriminated against. There's a series of demonstrations that they did. The second was unfortunately targeted by ISIS, and up to 90 people were killed. The community remained mobilized though, and ultimately their movement led to negotiations that were successful in forcing the government to stop the project until there had been an independent review. That's just one example. There's also something called the Uprising for Change. It's a series of sit-ins that took place in Kabul and also in other cities. These sit-ins were ultimately forcibly removed by the government, by security forces, in an attack that killed at least one protester. The People's Peace Movement, you may have heard of. This is the march that started in Helmand province that ended in Kabul, but later continued to Balkh and Mazar-e-Sharif. It was a diverse group of marchers, essentially included an elderly man, a man on crutches. And it toured the country to hold rallies and gatherings to talk about the prospect of peace. They were met with a lot of support for citizens who understandably are really fed up with the war and violence taking place in the country. And they're also met with skepticism and hostility and even repression, as messages of peace sometimes are. The Taliban kidnapped members of the group multiple times before releasing them. Like other movements, the outbreak of the pandemic caused the group to really shift what they were doing to focus on COVID education. Today, the movement is continuing its calls for the end of the use of violence. They're actually using the Taliban narrative against them, saying essentially the withdrawal of international troops removes any justification for the use of violence in the country. Across the border in Pakistan, in the Pashtun areas, we've seen the emergence of an incredibly impressive display of people power. The PTM movement is a movement of tens of thousands of young people that include women, older folks, people that represent all demographics in the society. And they've conducted really powerful nonviolent campaigns that resist the US-backed Pakistan military and also insurgency violence. And they've created a really powerful narrative, basically shaming lawmakers and leaders. You know, the movement is framed as a human rights movement, you know, saying that people deserve to live a life free of violence. They're extremely disciplined and nonviolent, and they're articulating a really progressive vision for society. But these movements are not very well known. In fact, ignoring the movements is really, I think, to their detriment and also to ours. For Afghanistan, these movements and the other displays of people power that we've seen exercised in the country were and are important opportunities to really encourage and foster alternative structures of leadership that could really be important alternatives to the existing power holders in the region, many of whom are former warlords. They've offered the Afghan government and the international community an opportunity to really enable grassroots leadership by young people into Afghan politics. Catherine, I think you're trying to interrupt. I'm just going to wrap up by saying that, you know, these really constitute missed opportunities, right? 63% of the population in Afghanistan is under the age of 25. There is a way to engage with these groups in the past and in the future that really could help foster, you know, the creation of a genuine public base that really has faith in democratic institutions and governance. But instead, we've seen in case after case how these groups have been not only marginalized, but repressed. And along with the sort of multiple other types of violence that they face, this has been really difficult to withstand. But in spite of that, I see really grounds for hope in looking at these cases. Has been an exercise in hope for me. Afghans have a lot to teach us. They're not merely victims. We need to make sure we don't see them that way. That really ignores the reality on the ground. And if Afghans can seek nonviolent alternatives in spite of the extremely difficult situation they face, that should give the rest of us hope for the future of Afghanistan, but also future of all of our societies.
Thank you, Jamila. Actually, right on time. It's perfect. Okay, so it's really interesting, the history of all the movements and all of the, you know, the agency that people have displayed over the years in Afghanistan, and we'll get into that more with our discussion. Kathy, I'm going to go to you next. And my question to you, the general, tell me about your connection to Afghanistan, your ongoing work, and why Afghanistan and the current and future there matters so much to you. And can you talk a little bit about the youth program in Afghanistan that you and others observed over the last decade, including activities they were involved in, things you learned while visiting them in the field, and also with the international delegations that were part of that working together, and any current information that you can share. Go ahead, Kathy.
Well, thank you, Catherine. And I'm really both challenged and deeply impressed by the eloquence of what we've heard so far, and the grappling with such a very, very intense and difficult situation. And I realize that there are people who are part of this call as people who've decided they wanted to participate, who who know a great deal more than I can ever know about Afghanistan. I feel like I sort of saw Afghanistan through a keyhole, but it was a really wonderful keyhole, if you will. I had been part of efforts to say, look, where you stand determines what you see. And so I and others would go to war zones and try to see what was happening to people who couldn't escape US wars by being in the war zone itself. And in Iraq, and at times we went to Gaza and to Lebanon. But at one point, because we knew about the emergency surgical centers for victims of war, these amazing hospitals that are functioning in war zones and do not discriminate, we got to know them in Iraq. And so I had a chance to go and visit one of those hospitals in Afghanistan. And I was deeply impressed by their work, but I also began to learn more about a group of youngsters who, now imagine this, in Afghanistan, they were so concerned about prisoners in Guantanamo that they were in a pup tent on a mountainside in the wintertime, fasting in solidarity with a number of us who were holding an annual fast in Washington, D.C. And we thought, well, could we ever talk with these youngsters? Could we meet with them? And so I was in this hospital in Kabul and had a chance to make a telephone connection after we'd had one connection while they were in their pup tent fasting via cell phone. Well, I want you to know that the group of young people I met never had electricity during the winter time. They very seldom had any kind of latrine facilities like we're familiar with. Their diets were sparse. Water was iffy, but they always had the most remarkable desire to try to overcome what we are talking about in terms of income inequality, which is often so much a source of violence. I saw them go up mountainsides where there wasn't even a road on an icy winter day to go in and sit with mainly widows and do, okay, let's call it surveillance. They did surveys, not with drones overhead, but with paper and pen, and a survey that asked, can you tell me how many times a month do you eat beans? Who is the main income earner for this household? And the house was really a mud hovel. And what's your access to water? What's your rent? And then when they realized that in many cases, the main income earner was under 12 years of age, then that survey went to the top. And then they figured out ways to help those impoverished widows get the materials to make these very heavy blankets. They just smother you, they're so heavy. And then they would get these rickety old trucks, they called them lorries, and pick up the blankets from the women and take them to the refugee camps and distribute them free of charge. Now we're talking about people in Afghanistan now who face harsh winter elements without electricity, without fuel, without blankets, and now tormented by hunger as well. But I know that the young people I was able to be with again and again and again, sometimes 3 times a year over the course of that past decade, that they believe in mutual aid and they believe in sharing resources. I saw them set up a school for street kids and create their own textbook because they knew it would kind of really be especially good for these kids who had really a very violent upbringing and next to nothing, and create classes in nonviolence for these young kids. And what was so interesting to me is if they ever had a chance to go on a field trip, because, it was a way to celebrate what they were doing, the kids came with them. And if they ever had a chance to have a bigger meal, the kids were there as well. So I saw these youngsters go to that hospital that I mentioned to donate blood. I saw them try to learn other people's languages, including, the Dari speaking people don't always speak Pashto, the Pashto speaking people don't always speak Dari, but I saw efforts to overcome those divides. I saw efforts for people to share chores. And that's pretty, that's not always the norm. in the societies that a lot of these kids were accustomed to. So I saw them kind of crossing borders, and they would even make these scarves that said on one end, Beduni Mers, without borders, and on the other, border free. And they wanted people internationally to know that this was something they cared about. So that's just my through the keyhole view, delivered with a great deal of desire to stop the torment of hunger in Afghanistan immediately and to help people have a future.
Thank you so much, Kathy. Yeah, a lot of deep issues here. Stellan, I'm going to move on to you. I would like you to also tell us about the work you've done in the field of resistance studies and the relevance to our discussion today about people power and agency in Afghanistan. What does the field of existence as resistance or everyday resistance mean, and how might it be relevant to our discussion about countering violence and building people power in Afghanistan?
Thank you. I'm honored to be part of this, and I want to say directly that I have never visited Afghanistan, and I'm not an expert on Afghanistan at all. But what I can talk about is what I've learned from both research and visits to struggles in India, South Africa, Brazil, Palestine, and the kind of experiences that people have built up through what's called resistance studies. So I would say that what is probably relevant here for Afghanistan is that every context is unique, and when you develop strategies and tactics, you need to make an analysis of the context and the kind of power that exists. And like any kind of regime, the Taliban's will be dependent on having some kind of order and some kind of a functional economy. And they need some kind of a legitimacy among its people in order to be able to rule. And it seems to me pretty clear that the situation is quite different today than compared to 96 when the Taliban was in power then. So that creates opportunities that people could use. Another thing that is pretty clear, and which you indicate with your question, Catherine, is well, everyday resistance and other forms of resistance. So the thing is that there exists a very broad repertoire of resistance that we are not being attentive to enough, I think, because we're used to that there exists armed resistance and unarmed resistance or nonviolent action, and research have shown how nonviolent action can be so much more powerful and effective in changing regimes than actually armed resistance. But there is so many other forms of resistance that also exist at the same time. So everyday resistance is one important part of that, and everyday resistance is more like hidden underground. It's more individualized. It's not a form of resistance that is public, confrontative, and collective, but it's when thousands of people are doing small actions in their everyday that might have an impact. And then we also have constructive work where people are building up parallel independent institutions and create more of independence in relationship to the state. So there's a broad repertoire of resistance that is available, and particularly people living under very hard, repressive, and difficult situations are using more of everyday resistance and constructive work in building up alternatives. But I mean, the conclusions from resistance studies is very much that we can develop and train and organize these forms of tactics in different contexts, and that resilience and the long-term plan is really necessary and central. So I would say that what is possible here is to look at the broader repertoire of resistance, to develop forms that are maybe not exposing people to the same kind of dangers as public displays of protest that might put people into the danger of that Taliban are simply shooting them down and executing people. So I would say that is an area where we could look more into the possibilities, and I do have some ideas of what that could involve, but I could return to that.
Great. Okay, thank you so much, Stellan. Again, I think it's so important right now to look at the whole, as you said, the broad spectrum of what is possible. And obviously, these decisions will be locally led and locally made, but also in solidarity with people in other places that have gone through and learned lessons in similar ways over the years. Zahir, we're going to go back to you now in our second round. And we're going to look at it just about 3 minutes each, so it'll have to be fairly concise from each of you, but following up, and then we'll have time for comments, questions, input from our participants. And if you all have questions, I've seen a couple that have come through in the chat. Please go ahead and put them in, or you can put your name in and say stack if you've had something that you would like to bring up or comment, and we'll let you do that directly once we get through this round, the second round of questions. So Zahir, you have taught in Afghanistan. You've trained numerous teachers and students over the years, utilizing the empowerment model promoted by Paulo Freire. You mentioned Bell Hooks, Cornel West, who I think many of us know and love. Can you talk briefly about how this raised awareness, how it increased agency among the teachers, students, and educational system that you were working in, and how these methods or philosophies might be useful now in Afghanistan and then going forward?
Thank you. Yes, what struck me as very interesting when I worked there with essentially academe, higher education people, the way that these authors or these ideas resonated with them. They of course, all these thinkers were foreign to most of them or many of them. But when I talked about the work of Paulo Freire, Cornel West, Bell Hooks, and other great pedagogues, the way that the Afghan men and women, majorities, minorities, the different ethnic groups, even upper class people, how they resonated with these ideas and these analyses in prognostications. So I found it hopeful that, if people are exposed to new thinking, just like any one of us here or in our own lives, in our own work, when you inject new ideas into people's thinking, people do ponder. They think about it and see what works, what doesn't, how it agrees with them, and how it doesn't. But I'm also, while working there or thinking about and struggling with the people there, with the oppressed Afghans, I also was mindful about being careful not to be Western-centric, Eurocentric, Western-centric, white supremacy, etc. In other words, I was mindful that, perhaps the real source of the Afghan miseries are essentially systemic, structure, larger, global. And this is what we were reminded recently, whether you're listening to Antonio Guterres or Angela Merkel or the Norwegian Regional Council or Vladimir Putin or even Biden or Erdogan. Any of these people in the last few days have said, the European Union, that we should not penalize the vast majority of the Afghans for the misbehavior of the Taliban and the medievalism of the Taliban. And I really agree with that. Mr. Sultan Barakat, who is a think tank person in Qatar, he says that, there's a new reality in Afghanistan, and we sort of have to take that reality, so to speak, and accept it as a challenge and as an opportunity. It's problematic, it's challenging, but it could be worked with. And Mr. Barakat urges that the world community sort of engage the Taliban, work with them, negotiate with them, dialogue with them, talk to them, and try to alter their behavior, using, in other words, sort of sticks and carrots. So I would remind all of us that we don't just solely focus on the Afghans, the oppressed Afghans, whether we're promoting this or that, but that we also equally focus on the larger systemic structural sources of violence, of misery, of degradation, these historical patterns, that have existed throughout the world, where certain countries and people have dominated, pillared, plunged, and exploited, other people's special resource countries. So the problem is not just there, but it's also here. And Mr. Barakat says that we should quickly engage the Taliban, be very clear about our expectations, what we want from them, what the world expects before they can be recognized and supported as such. But the whole world, including President Biden, who was on the G20 virtual conference 2 days ago, also said that the United States should continue helping the Afghan people and should establish a trust fund. And this is what Antonio Guterres is saying. Establish an international trust fund, where all of the support, whether it's cash, material, food, etc., healthcare system, would go directly to the Afghan people. And I think this can be done. We shouldn't try to either change, quote, transform completely, or replace the people that we don't like. And this is what the president of Turkmenistan said, that we should set aside our own ideas, ideologies, prejudices, preconceptions, misconceptions, etc., and before we engage people, that we should accept people as we are and work with them, and then try to sort of modify their behavior and try to get them to behave like a genuine nation state. So that's what I'd like to see happening.
Thank you so much for those really important perspectives and additional kind of view of things. Much appreciated. Next, we're going to Jamila. And Jamila, this is great because we're having this kind of back and forth between the kind of mega analysis, root causes of violence, international responsibility, which is so key, and then also the people power and the agency of people that are in Afghanistan that can't get out and that are having to live and rebuild and survive right now. Based on what you talked about earlier, can you follow up a little with lessons learned, challenges you see today, and any information you have on current actions or possible ideas for the future for Afghans seeking to build a just, free, and peaceful society? What about women and girls and the Hazara, which is one of the main minorities that are at risk you mentioned earlier? And then I'm going to kind of pull into that. Helena Koban is mentioning, and that can be part of our question and answer, but this idea of how mutual aid versus resistance, if they're connected, how you might use both. And kind of, she's saying she likes the term, and it's a lot longer to read her comment, but mutual aid versus resistance. But I know that in our work with groups around the world, we're seeing the two combined, especially after COVID hit. So go ahead.
Thanks, Kathy. I think that, that's a lot to address there. I think that what we've seen in the country has really demonstrated the emergence of a new generation of young people and civil societies who are recognizing the potential power of this type of nonviolent organizing and mobilizing, and also are gaining more experience in sort of collective decision-making processes. I appreciate very much, Stellan's contribution about everyday acts of resistance, and more specifically, the focus on constructive programs, because we're seeing a lot of that in Afghanistan over the past 20 years. If anything, that's been a positive consequence of the past 2 decades. We've seen a proliferation of thousands of organizations They're working on diverse issues. So yes, political organizations and human rights groups, but also cultural organizations, environmental, like reforestation, agriculture organizations, sports associations. These are essentially bases of power that are being developed in the communities. Gandhi saw these networks for their revolutionary potential. This is power and capacity that doesn't just enable communities to meet their needs from their own resources, as limited as those might be, but also these bases of power can be used to resist unjust policies and can be used to help expand rights. So we've seen the development in the past 2 decades of a very vibrant media sector. We have now dozens of print, radio, and television news sources. I've been watching these over the years. I'm in awe, really, of these journalists, their commitment to their work in spite of the risks that they face, and they've been targeted a lot in Afghanistan. It's one of the worst places in the world to be a journalist. So there's also been, I think that people have come to rely on this broadcasting of this wide range of diverse views. They've come to appreciate the sources of entertainment. There's also the availability of mobile phones, the internet, social media, which has just further expanded access to diverse views, information, and it creates an environment that looks very different than 20 years ago. And so I think there is going to be a cost with the development of this power. There will be a cost to any attempts to take away these kinds of capacities and access to information, to entertainment that people have come to enjoy and that they've worked hard to preserve and to expand. We've seen throughout the past 2 decades, and more recently also, the use of art, the use of music, of poetry, of culture to express values and to foster a sense of community. We've seen also a reclaiming of culture and religion, and it's been an effective way for Afghans in the midst of a very repressive environment, not just in the past 2 months, but before that as well, to express dissent, but really to also foster unity and hope, a sense of community and belonging. We saw this recently in Herat, where people were chanting in the streets and from their rooftops, Allahu Akbar, God is great, which of course for Muslims is an expression of religion, of faith, but it's also an expression of community and defiance and also of hope. And it has a history going back to the Soviet times as a relatively lower risk way that people could express community and defiance. And that's what people said that it's done in Herat and also among Afghans in the diaspora. So I think it's a time of great anxiety for Afghans and uncertainty. Moments of transition always are, even sometimes in the best of circumstances. But obviously the Afghan story is far from over. There's 30 million people that are going to have to survive this, and that will do that in spite of what comes next. And even if that's uncertain, I do, see possibilities. I heard a girls' education activist. She said, if they limit the curriculum, I'm going to upload more books to an online library. If they limit the internet, I'm going to send books to homes. If they limit teachers, I'm going to start an underground school. So I have an answer for everything. And so I think there's a hunger for resources, right? We have to remember that we can't just rely on people's mythological resiliency, right? They do require support. They require attention. They require help that is actually helpful. And I don't mean telling people what to do or imposing any kind of solutions that don't work in the local context. But the beautiful part is people are doing it anyway. And we've seen a real hunger for resources. I think there's a major opportunity to provide some of these resources in local languages, talking about nonviolent resistance literature. There's some material, for example, on the International Center of Nonviolent Conflict website in Pashto and in Dari. My late father produced some of those translations. So we obviously have seen over decades the hunger for those resources. In fact, we heard a story where someone was walking in a public park, and he saw a young woman reading, I think it was From Dictatorship to Democracy by by our colleague and mentor, Jean Sharp. And it was in Pashto. And he said, "Where did you get this book?" And she said, "Well, someone gave it to me. And this is my third time reading it. It's my third time reading it because there's such a lack of resources for which there is such a hunger for that." So I think that that's important for us to remember, that this is not, our imposing those solutions, but that people are searching them, and that they're searching nonviolent solutions. And, there's a responsibility for us to highlight their stories, to give them a platform, like the way that Waging Nonviolence does, like the way that all of our colleagues do in our field, to really highlight these stories, because I think they offer people themselves grounds for hope. And if we do the opposite, if we ignore them, I think we send a message that it's violence that gets the international community's attention. I think that's a really dangerous narrative in this age, when actually people are, questioning the effectiveness of nonviolent resistance. And so we have an opportunity and really a responsibility to do better in providing resources that can make their struggles more effective.
Great. Thank you, Jamila. You gave me shivers with the comment from the quote from the young woman activists and students. And again, a lot of hopeful possibilities in the middle of a very, very dire situation. Kathy, I'm going to head to you next. And we actually are having a lot of really great questions and some cool comments in the chat as well. Based on your work in many conflict zones around the world, including Iraq, Afghanistan, Palestine, you've also done work with Yemen and other places. Can you talk about the concerns that you have for the current situation in Afghanistan, especially for vulnerable populations, and a little bit about possible areas of awareness building, agency, mutual aid that is very needed, and people power that might be available for them around these challenges that they're dealing with? And then anything you want to say about this idea of external allies, people that want to help and support in solidarity, but being sure that it's done in a do no harm method, and it's not trying to direct them in any way, but giving them local agency. Go ahead, Kathy.
Well, thank you. Listening to Jamila, I'm remembering a line that stories are often our number one way of understanding realities. I was in Iraq during the 2003 shock and awe bombing, and every time there would be a huge, sickening thud, the local mosque would play the call to prayer. And it was just a reminder to me that people could still give an expression. Well, I also was in Iraq during a time of economic sanctions imposed on Iraq. And, anytime the United States has lost a war, think about the Vietnam War. The United States imposed terrific punishment through economic warfare subsequently. And I saw those economic sanctions against Iraq as an economic warfare. I mean, and it makes no sense. It's absolutely backwards. If you want to help a group of people to be able to, in some way, grapple with their reality, then don't undermine their education. Don't isolate them completely. Don't make their economic situation so miserable that all they'll be able to think about every day is, how am I going to put some food on the table? And in fact, with the United States having set up 500 military bases across Afghanistan, of course, many people were saying, well, the only way we can put food on our table right now is to work with some kind of warlord group, because they're the ones who have the money. So we have to, I think, be Gandhian in our commitment to truth force and tell the truth about how it is that Afghanistan has reached this situation. And reparations become a very important word. And not to be meddlesome, not to say, okay, we're going to go in there and repair Afghanistan. No. We've already shown as a nation that the United States simply could not, would not, did not accomplish that. But when I hear reparations, I not only am wanting to say back off with the economic warfare, but also repair the systems within the warring countries, the United States and NATO being the most equipped, the most vicious, repair those systems. Do you know that the August 29th bombing of the family of Zaher Ahmadi has not yet been addressed? 10 people were killed in that family. 7 of them were children. And as the LA Times reported yesterday, the United States hasn't said one word to those survivors. So we have to be honest about the effect, the impact in the past on Afghanistan, and try not to repeat the wrongs that have been done through the combination, the terrible combination of economic and military warfare, and then learn from Afghans, as Jamila has so beautifully pointed out to us.
Yes.
Thank you so much, Kathy. Yeah, beautifully said. Okay, so Stellan, we're going to end this second round and the actual questions and kind of comments from the panelists with you. Please follow up on the other panelists' comments and views where you think your ongoing activist scholar research and experience with other countries and other types of resistance could give possible insights into what people on the ground could develop or build to ensure human rights, livelihood, and a brighter future for themselves and their families. What are the biggest challenges you see going forward? And Bibi, we're going to go, when we get to questions and answers right after this and comments, she mentions this idea about, the connection. How would you get the Taliban to move forward with human rights and women's rights? You may not be able to answer that question. That may be the million-dollar question, but people are thinking about those key issues and how Afghans and others, allies, could help support that movement. Go ahead.
Thank you. Yeah, so I think we can learn a bit from other struggles around in the world, and that there is a need to begin small and evaluate and escalate from what you learn, and being creative and alert to what the Taliban are doing when you're doing different forms of actions. And a challenge is, of course, to deal with the crisis, the humanitarian crisis around poverty and overcoming fear. So some of the things that people have done in other struggles that I think is helpful here to think about is to not just think about resistance as something where you need to concentrate people to one place, because then you're also becoming vulnerable for repressive violence. But you can also have more dispersed tactics, like boycotts and so on, where people are not risking so much. There is a tradition in India that I learned of where people stay at home. And the stay at home activity is something which doesn't expose people to risk, but it's a strike and a boycott at the same time. You kind of empty the towns by staying at home. And as I said before, we shouldn't just focus on confrontative actions, but there is also this importance of constructive tactics of building up things. And that's where mutual aid comes in and is really central for actions. Mm-hmm. I guess underground organizing, building communicative networks and associations is going to be important in Afghanistan. And educate people and spread texts over Pashto, as some people mentioned in the chat. There is a handbook on activism in Pashto right now. So I think also when we think about doing resistance, it's important to develop autonomous communities, the way that the indigenous people have done, like the Zapatistas or so, where mutual aid is really essential for people to build up networks and also build solidarity resources that makes it possible to do resistance. And then I think when it comes to the constructive building of parallel institutions in economic, political, cultural terms, I think the Jirga, the traditional council locally among different people in Afghanistan, is very important. It's a way of creating legitimacy for decisions and building solidarity among different groups in Afghanistan. So if that could be combined with also autonomous villages that are building on mutual aid, people will be stronger and more able to do resistance. And I also mentioned that everyday resistance is something that is useful here, and that is learning from the resistance of the most marginalized, repressed, like prisoners, peasants, slaves, and migrants that have been using everyday resistance. So everyday resistance is basically an individual, hidden, dispersed form of resistance. So if we think about, for example, that the growing bureaucracy of the state in Afghanistan, which involves hundreds of thousands of people that have to work within the Taliban state, there is a possibility of everyday resistance in the forms of working slow, misunderstanding instructions, using equipment, taking longer breaks, and not doing the job well, which is less a risk for people than standing out on any square and shouting your slogans and showing up with signs, which makes you into a target. So yeah, I think these kind of things could be perhaps helpful, but basically it's a matter of creative development of tactics and strategies from the context itself, where people that live in Afghanistan and work there are the experts, and I'm just coming up with a brainstorm of ideas, and it might be useful in Afghanistan or it might not. But just a last point is that I think one of the most impressive movements today that we could learn from is the landless workers in Brazil. And what they are doing is that when they occupy land, they mobilize the poorest people in Brazil. And they are clear about that people need food, which is the same situation in Afghanistan. People need survival. But it's when they occupy the land, they also create alternative structures, cooperatives, schools like Dr. Wahab was lifting up with Paulo Freire pedagogics. So they are inspired by that kind of alternative building of structures. And I think it's when we do that, we have immediate solutions for people's need today, but it's also part of building the networks of solidarity for people's collective mobilization. Then also it becomes possible with confrontative, more riskful resistance later on. Individuals will never be very impactful in resistance at the end of the day.
Thank you very much, Stellan. And it's really interesting because a lot of what you just brought up is what Solidarity 2020 and Beyond was founded on, this idea of activists and organizers getting together in peer-to-peer exchanges to exchange the knowledge, the skills, the ideas, the challenges that they have to support each other and give the tools and ideas. And then those are locally led and locally implemented, as you said, in what's possible. So we are we are done with the formal part of the panelists. I wanted to say, first of all, it's been amazing. And I'm looking at a lot of really great comments and questions in the chat. I want to just quickly introduce Brittany Bartlett and Emily Sowers. They're here from Madre, which is, as you know, this is also a fundraiser. We want to really, again, appreciate all of you that have donated through tickets and special donations. And as we've heard, there is dire need in Afghanistan. There's no way to resist and build a better country, a better future unless you're alive and unless you survive. And it's a really critical time coming up on winter. So we are sending these funds directly to the field that you've donated. I want Brittany and Emily, just to say hello and just kind of a 1-minute overview on where the funds are going in the work of Madre. And Kathy Kelly also has an important organization that they partner with that's also getting the funds directly to the field, to the women and girls and people that need. That was our criteria to send the funds, and we need to get them there directly, and these are going there directly. So Brittany and Emily, do one of you just want to say a little bit about Madre? Welcome, and we really appreciate that you'll be sending those to the field, to your networks.
Sure. Thank you. Hi, everyone. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. Hi, everyone. My name is Emily. And I first just wanted to say a huge thank you to Catherine and Eric and Michael, as well as all the panelists, Solidarity 2020 and Beyond, Nonviolence International, Waging Nonviolence, and then everyone else who's joined the webinar today for this important conversation. Madre is an international human rights organization and women's fund that partners with community-based, women-led organizations on the front lines of war, climate breakdown, and their aftermath. Founded in 1983, Madre uplifts the leadership of visionary young women and girls, Indigenous women, Afro-descendant women, LGBTIQ+ people, and people with disabilities. We offer a holistic model of support to our grassroots partners using 3 interconnected strategies, which are grant-making, organizational strengthening, and legal advocacy, to address immediate priorities identified by our partners and forge opportunities for women and girls to assert their agency and create lasting social change. Through these strategies, we provide long-term and flexible financial and direct service support, particularly to women's groups in marginalized communities where war and disaster has rendered them difficult to fund, challenging to reach, and/or unable to absorb grants from larger funders. Together with our grassroots partners in Latin America and the Caribbean, the Middle East, Africa, Asia, and the Pacific, and the US, Madre meets urgent needs in hard-hit communities and creates durable solutions to violence against people and the planet. And Brittany and I we both wanted to share a little bit, so I'm just going to pass it quickly over to Brittany, and she's going to give just a little update on Madre's work in Afghanistan. So thank you again.
Thank you, Emily. If you can put a link there that people can donate more, that'd be awesome. We've made about $1,200, I believe, so far. And so that's awesome. That will really make a difference for people. But if you'd like to give more and you're feeling generous and you're able, please do so.
Yes.
Go ahead, Brittany.
Thanks, everyone. So our primary focus right now is to protect the lives of women's rights activists who are facing the upsurge in targeted assassination attempts by the Taliban. Fighters have gone door to door, painting big pink marks on the houses of women they've deemed to step out of line. Through our Afghan Women's Survival Fund, we're supporting an underground escape and support network for women in need of emergency relocation, along with humanitarian aid as families are facing shortages of food, fuel, and water due to the compounded crises of the collapse of the government, COVID-19, and drought. So our work spans across 4 different areas: humanitarian aid, resettlement efforts, preventing gender-based violence, and security and documenting crimes. So far, we've worked with partners to support more than 1,000 women's rights activists and their families who are facing these assassination attempts, including at least 250 young women human rights defenders. No matter the crisis, women and girls, more often than not, are the ones who hold the solutions and the key to the greatest challenges of our time. Madre is there to uplift feminist movements around the world that have always been there, whether the wider international community knows about them or not, whether they've been featured on, CNN or BBC or some other news outlet. And these movements will continue to persist and thrive long after any of us are here. So that's really what our organization is about and what we're focused on right now.
Thank you so much, Brittany and Emily, and we're really happy to be partnering with you to work toward mutual aid and accompaniment of the groups in Afghanistan that are really at risk. Kathy, do you want to just give a little plug for also the fundraising and the group that you're working with?
Well, thank you to Brittany and Emily. We've been, a number of us, kind of immersed in correspondence with people who are facing some of the direct challenges that were just named to us. And it's quite difficult to get money through, say, MoneyGram or Western Union these days, but through Australia, there is a way for money to go to a PayPal account, and then under the supervision of the Edmund Rice Center, we have been able to move some money to some of the people who face tremendous need, just as was described. So I will put that PayPal address in the chat, and anybody would be welcome to get in touch with me. You know, there's also, if anyone would be interested, it's a good time to be in correspondence with people who are feeling isolated and desperate, and kind of be a buddy. You know, the mention was made of resettlement and people that are sometimes having to move their residencies like weekly because of being in danger. So please don't hesitate to get in touch. If it's all right, I'll also put my own email in the chat. Thank you very much.
Yeah, and we will have follow-up email to everyone that attended with information about our next in the series, as well as resources that you've mentioned and issues. That's great. Thank you, Kathy. Okay, now I'm going to get to several questions. Ian Hollingworth, you mentioned that you actually had two questions about two specific resources, a female Afghan orchestra and the nonviolence training manual and posture that I think also Stellan mentioned. And I know Eric on waging nonviolence has also featured a story about it. So do you want to ask any more about that question directly? You can unmute yourself and ask, or just if anyone in the panel or the audience participants knows anything about those two questions, it would be great if you could feedback now.
Well,
Yeah, sure.
I know that the orchestra, which I've listened to myself, they are all out. I think they're in Italy now. I don't know about the second question, but the orchestra and the music school has been closed and the people have gotten out.
Thank you, Dr. Wahab. Anything about the manual? Stellan, you mentioned it, and I know, Eric, you've done a story on it. Any more information about where it is now or how it's working? Jamila, if you know.
Someone said it was there are hard copy versions in a Kabul library. I mean, for how long is the next question, but is it actually still being used underground for any sort of teaching activities? I don't know. I mean, I don't know if people will know that or not.
Thank you for that question, Ian. Anyone know anything more about that?
I don't have an update on that. Maybe Jamila knows. I don't know if she's still here.
No, I am here, and I think that's the one created by Ahmadullah Archewal. So he's someone that we might ask about that. But I think you know, the end of that article says that the material is actually as important as it is still basic. And I think what the lesson there is that we need to create updated material. We need to like advance the resources. And so it'd be very interesting to see how was that manual useful, and in what ways could it be collectively improved.
Great. Thank you, Jamila. And as she mentioned, our colleague, Archewal Ahmadullah, who's from Afghanistan, he'd also asked about possibly being on the panel, but there's some issues around his family's safety and other issues, but he has written a number of manuals. He's a specialist on the movement that Jamila talked about, as well as Basha Khan, who is another kind of Pashtun Gandhi, basically, led a number of nonviolent resistance movements, especially against the British, but also building up their own society back in the 30s, 40s, 50s. And so he is also a specialist on that issue as well. And we could get you in touch and get you connected to him too. Carolyn McCoy, you had the next question in the line. Are you still there, and would you like to ask it yourself or not? And you can just unmute. Yes, and Sherry Morin is mentioning, that's important too, that Michael Beer's new book on all of the additional types of tactics that are out there that builds on Gene Sharp's original 198. They have just published that in Farsi and Dari. And so that's also going to be available in the field. And that's a very important resource that can be used.
Yeah, here, my question is kind of where, I don't know how you start to do resistance when you're starving. How do we support people whose immediate need is food? I would just think, just surviving becomes the paramount question for everyone, and that resistance kind of takes a backseat to just surviving and getting enough to eat. And how do we support people in those most urgent and immediate needs?
Mm-hmm. Yes.
Well, I think it's a matter of how. Of course, it's the priority is people's survival. But the question is how? Is it the state organizing it, or is it corporations doing it? Or is it communities organizing it through developing of their capacities to take care of themselves in the similar way as the landless workers in Brazil? So I think mutual aid and these kind of ways of taking care of people's needs are ways of building solidarity networks that creates the possibility of resistance. But you can also, when you take care of people's poverty, you can increase the power of the state and corporations by letting them provide it. And that's kind of the opposite.
Yeah. Can I comment on this?
Sure, go ahead.
Yes, I think a lot of well-intentioned people in this country and organizations, I think we have sort of analyzed, studied, even assisted the oppressed to death, I would say. I mean, oppression involved both the oppressed and the oppressor. I would like to urge us to sort of focus on the oppressor also, which is the United States. You know, the United States is the largest machinery of political, economic, cultural, social, and military oppression. Afghanistan was more or less eating, at least people were eating. What happened to this country after $2 trillion and 20 years of assistance and so forth, where people are starving? Maybe we should focus on the behavior of the empire itself and how it metes out violence all over the world, historically, currently, and in the future. And how the empire needs to stop behaving like an empire and behave like a nation state of the community of nations and leave people alone.
Thank you very much, Zahir. And I think that's something for all of those of us who are Americans who need to be advocating, pressuring, doing our own organizing to get our country to change its behavior, as you said, both in Afghanistan and around the world. I want to go to Helena Koban next. She's had a lot of really interesting comments and some questions. Helen, do you want to just go ahead and unmute and either just make a comment or ask a question, whatever you'd like to do?
Thank you, Catherine. I don't know, should I start my video? I'm not really looking good. But
it's okay. If you'd rather not, it's fine. And if you'd like to, yeah, either way. Go ahead.
Don't worry.
Anyway, I want to thank everybody for some really important and thought-provoking presentations. I do have a real question about, it's been mentioned a little bit that, how can we talk about organizing resistance when people are literally starving on the mountainsides? And what does resistance mean in those contexts? I also think that we need to be wary, we who are American citizens, about calling for resistance in a situation where the country has no functioning government. And, there's a lot of people in progressive movements who love to kind of think that you can deliver what, basic needs without having a functioning national government. That honestly is not true. I've lived in Lebanon for back then in the civil war for 6-7 years. We look at Libya, we look at all these places where the national government has been destroyed, and you see the misery of the people. I've also worked in Mozambique in a post-conflict, looking at the post-conflict situation, which carried on for a long time and is actually still carrying on in terms of, just the fragility of Mozambique after its years of civil war, which ended, in 1994. But, you need a national administration that can deliver basic services and above all, public security. So, how you build that needs grassroots movements to work on building it. It needs political parties. It needs all kinds of things. It needs the kind of funds that our government is now withholding from the Afghan people. And I think for us as Americans, our main demand should be that our government release Afghanistan's funding to, some combination of the UN and so on. Anyway, I'd just love to put that in there and get responses.
Yes, there's no money there because the money is kept at the World Bank, IMF, in the Federal Reserve in New York.
Thank you, Zahir. Any other comments? Jamila, Kathy, Stellan.
Well, I think this is a terrible time for the United States to be thinking that it can control through manipulating hunger the future of another country. We've already contributed to Afghanistan becoming a failed narco state.
Yes.
And we have no right whatsoever to think that if we push people to desperation because they're hungry and they're tormented by starvation, that they'll overthrow a governance that we are not happy to see. Economic sanctions, it doesn't just pressure people, it's a wallop. And it hits the most vulnerable people, and it hits them hard. And here I am in the United States with a refrigerator, with electricity, with flush toilets, with so much comfort. What possible right do we have to be using economic measures to further bludgeon people in Afghanistan? It's not fair, it's not right, and it should bring all of us to a point of feeling almost revulsion to the point where we wouldn't be able to stomach our next meal. That's what should happen.
Exactly.
Thank you, Kathy. Stellan, I see you unmute, and Jamila, you all may have some feedback as well.
Yeah, I agree, but I want to add something, and that is that I think the key question is, how do you get any state to prioritize the most poor? I mean, that is the question. So I mean, take India, where you have a very rich state, a very organized, centralized state. But if you ask the people that are living in the millions in the slums, if they're expecting the help from the state, of course they're not. So I think it's a matter of organizing mutual aid and organizing communities to support themselves and create a pressure on the state to make the priorities of people's human needs. We will never expect the US government or any government, the Taliban's, to prioritize the poor. That is a matter of organizing. The state is not a solution in itself.
Thank you, Stellan. Jamila, go ahead.
Yeah, I also would agree with all of that, and maybe our role as U.S. citizens is to really examine really how we have and are continuing to not just play an unhelpful role, but contribute and make possible extreme suffering in Afghanistan. We all agree in the need for a functioning government. Of course, that goes without saying. There's no substitute for that. But I think, again, how do we get there? I think in the absence of that, in the absence of helpful policies toward Afghanistan, we can still look at what people themselves are doing and can do. And so, you know, I think maybe there's some helpfulness to that, but I think, and how we can support that is extremely important, but it may be that those means are extremely limited, the way in which we can actually influence what's going on inside the country. It's extremely complex, and our solutions, you know, simply cannot be imposed in a society where people are, once again, like, you know, starving. So, yeah, I guess, I think for all of us, examine our own roles. How are we contributing to systems of oppression in our own societies and societies around the world? And it's very often easier to point to the failings of other, you know, institutions or other kind of leaders, but it's also extremely important to look at how we're contributing to that.
Well,
Thank you so much, Jamila.
We have a rotten political system in Afghanistan today because the United States for 42 years systematically, deliberately destroyed the polity in Afghanistan.
Yes, yes. Thank you, Zahir. It's time to end, but it's been an amazing discussion. I want to give Barbara Briggs just 1 minute. She's actually had a number of questions that she has asked. And so we're going to just go for 5 more minutes. I appreciate most people have stayed, and we know that if you have to get off, that's okay. And I do want to say very much appreciation from Nonviolence International, Waging Nonviolence, and Solidarity 2020 and Beyond, the co-sponsors. But I'm going to give Barbara, if you'd like to unmute and just make one more comment or question. I know you had several, and then we'll just get literally, you know, a sentence in response for any panelists that would like to follow, and that will be our closing. So go ahead, Brittany, if you still would like to ask or comment. You would just need to unmute, Brittany. And that's, I'm sorry, Barbara, sorry about that. I'm looking up Brittany's name. Okay.
Actually, I asked no questions.
Okay, you had some good comments, I think, yeah?
Yeah, I did have a comment. Why don't you summarize? Because go ahead for efficiency of time.
Why don't you go ahead, because I'm not looking. There were a number that I've been watching come through. Would you like to do that, or I can find it? One of your last, but you had a lot of good comments that I've been following as we've gone along. So
I'm quite confused because I only had one comment, so I think you'd better say what you think was important.
You know, I think it might have been BB Basir Bita.
Oh, that could be Kathy. Okay, maybe I'm just assuming, since you're still there, Barbara Briggs, that was BB. Okay, so so Barbara, if you'd like to say anything, if not, I think this is a perfect way to end then. I want to thank everyone for amazing comments, questions, input, and especially the panelists. You all have done an amazing job, and again, just given us a lot of food for thought. I think a lot of different perspectives, top down, bottom up, people power, but also the meta-analysis that is also so important. And I want to thank everyone for contributing. I want to go around now just very quickly then to each of our panelists and just one kind of quick closing that you'd like to make, a sentence or two that you'd like to end the panel today with. And let's start with Stellan. We'll go the back direction. Go for it, Stellan.
Yeah, I would say build on the traditions that Jamila told about of resistance that has already been there, evaluate and work for the long term.
Okay, Kathy.
Well, I know that the Bibi Basir Bita is one Afghan person from whom we have much to learn, and let us each make our commitments to continue to learn from Afghans. I'm so grateful to have been with Jamila and Dr. Zaher Wahab on this panel. And Stellan, thank you for saying that we must learn how to make the poorest of people our #1 priority. Thank you.
And Dr. Wahab.
Yeah, improving the human conditions over warfare and imperialism. Help the Afghan people to live.
Thank you. And Jamila, we are going to give you the last word.
Great. I guess I would just thank everyone and thank you all for your excellent contributions. This has been a very important and often difficult conversation also. I would just urge us, as I remind myself all the time, to resist any sort of fatalistic inevitability about what happens next in Afghanistan. It really depends on what, you know, in spite of their vulnerability, it depends on what people themselves do. And so I think we should all remember that and retain hope for them and for ourselves.
Thank you. Okay, so we'll wrap it up. If everyone would like to unmute at one time, you can unmute and just say goodbye so long in your own language. We appreciate everyone. So,
okay.
Goodbye.
Goodbye.
Thanks so much,
Thank you.
everybody.
Au revoir.
Assalamualaikum. Masalam.
Thank you so much.
Okay, goodbye.
All the affairs.